So,
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good night. On behalf of the International Sociological Association's Research Committee on Poverty, Social Welfare, and Social Policy, RC19, and ACAPACA, a platform of Latin American social movements to decolonize international aid, we welcome you to this conversation online that we hope will be the first of several. Esta conversación está siendo traducida al español. Si hay alguna persona que necesita pues la traducción, deberían ver un botón abajo que les da la opción. Y si no lo ven, pueden hacer clic en More o Más. Y allí debería estar la opción para ustedes. So we'll have translation from English to Spanish and from Spanish to English. And that requires people to choose a specific option. Yes? I am Juliana Martinez Franzoni, president of RC19, researcher at the University of Costa Rica. Let me tell you that this initiative seeks to bring together voices from comparative social policy research on the one hand, and the world of international aid, especially those actively involved in rethinking and decolonizing humanitarian practices and power dynamics within global aid systems. As we all know, people's well-being is rooted in the so many little big things of everyday life: food, shelter, clean water, learning, healing, going around in familiar settings. So for those of us who study social policy and social welfare, we understand these basic needs as usually satisfied through a welfare mix of state services, family care, community and international organizations, and also markets. It is through various combinations of these institutions that public goods, unpaid work, and out-of-pocket manage or fail to deliver well-being. Under informal security regimes, to borrow from the work of Goff and Wood, is mostly informal networks of community organizations and international aid organizations that deliver welfare. This is not an optimal welfare mix, but it's one that can be stable. Here today, we are talking about a very different scenario. We are talking about an insecurity regime where informal arrangements of welfare provision are unstable as the result of a systematic and deliberate dismantling of both formal and informal welfare mechanisms through siege, bombings, control over humanitarian access, targeted destruction of healthcare and education systems, also the use of surveillance and displacement to weaken kinship, networks, and severe community trust. So we are talking today about the most extreme circumstances that we can find, where life-supporting systems and institutions have been or are being intentionally and comprehensively unraveled by human decision-making. This is when Gaza and Sudan come into the picture and are clearly differentiated from other many different, also difficult situations. Our overall aim today is to nourish research agendas on the one hand, and conversations about decolonizing international aid on the other hand. To this aim, I am delighted to introduce you to our three speakers. Tamer Karmout, thank you for being here. Tamer is focused on international aid in conflict zones. He's an associate professor of public policy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He brings on-the-ground experience and research in post-conflict recovery, institutional reform, and the politics of foreign aid, especially in Gaza, Sudan, and other places where his work explores how aid operates in the absence of state structures. His perspective sharpens our understanding of how aid is governed and contested under conditions of institutional collapse. Then we have Sofia Sprechman-Cineiro. Sofia's focus is on humanitarian practice and aid decolonization conversation. Sophia contributes deep practitioner knowledge from decades in global humanitarian response across the Global South. As former General Secretary of CARE and a leader in decolonizing aid and co-founder of the Pledge for Change, she brings a grounded view of how institutional power, field realities, and reform efforts intersect in real time. And third, we have Oliver Walton. Oliver's focus is on social policy, welfare, and conflict. Oliver is a reader in international development at the University of Bath and brings to this conversation research expertise on social policy in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. His work examines how welfare systems mutate under stress, the legitimacy of NGOs, and the political economy of aid, especially in the Middle East and North African region, helping us analyze then the collapse of public institutions beyond just war impacts. So before we start this conversation, let me also thank deeply Ana Luego and Josue Serra for their generosity in providing voluntary support to translate this conversation from and to Spanish. So without further ado, let's dive straight into this conversation, which will be an informal and dynamic conversation structured around 3-4 themes. Each speaker will have about 1.5, or at the most 2 minutes to respond. But the idea is that they will be also engaging with each other's perspectives as we go. We will have this conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. You are welcome, you are all welcome to submit written questions throughout the session, and we'll bring those into the conversation either as we go or in the final segment. So let's start, let's begin with the basics. Let us delineate the conceptual and empirical territory we aim to discuss today. First, let us talk about what do we mean by human-made crisis and comprehensive human-made crisis when it comes to people's welfare. These are situations where systems break down not due to natural disasters, but due to systematic human actions. But Sophia, let us start with you. How would you define this specific type of crisis that we are trying to address, and how is it different from other types of crisis? Can you also share examples as you explain?
Of course, Juliana, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts and reflections, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and to the dialogue also with the audience in the chat box. So thank you so very much. So I think when we talk about human-led crisis, we mean crises that are created or intensified by human decisions. And those can be political, military, economic. But it's, of course, fundamentally different from a natural disaster. An earthquake or a cyclone may cause devastation, and it does. And of course, it causes devastation in a differentiated way, depending on, how solid your housing is. So we know it doesn't impact everyone in the same way. But here, we are talking about preventable and prolonged impacts in crisis, because people in power choose actions that push civilians into harm's way, or choose inaction when protection is urgently needed. So we have seen this, of course, very clearly in Gaza, where the destruction of health systems, water networks, food supplies, communications has been the result of deliberate choices. And we see this in Sudan. You mentioned Sudan, Juliana, as well, where armed groups restrict aid, weaponize hunger, displace communities as a strategy. So this is deliberate, and they come from, I would say, the way power is used, or rather misused. So human-led crises are not, they are therefore also acts that can be stopped. So the tragedy is that people create these crises. And of course, then the hope is that people can end them. But in this case, of course, in the cases I just mentioned, we see no end in sight.
Now, Olivier, well, two questions. Do you agree with how Sophia has characterized this human-made crisis, and how are social protection systems themselves implicated in creating or reinforcing the decision-making that leads to this crisis?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to the discussion, and looking forward to it. Yes, I agree with what Sophia has said about the human-led nature of these crises. And I think what we see in Gaza and Sudan, we're seeing sustained, purposeful attacks on people's lives and physical safety, but also on their ability to function as a community. So I'd also emphasize that aspect. I suppose one area where maybe I think there are some drawbacks is the concept of the crisis, or like a kind of situation of collapse. And I think there is sometimes a danger with that kind of labeling, that, in a sense, you're kind of depicting it as something more depoliticized or passive. And sometimes there is a danger with that kind of label, that you can underplay this more purposeful or kind of functional dimension of these situations. So, it's quite common to present situations of war as chaotic and dysfunctional, but we know actually that there's usually a strong logic and rationale behind them, and there are people who are benefiting from this situation as well. So to come to the point about the social protection system, so this is something that we've been looking at, is the relationship between social welfare and conflict. And I suppose traditionally welfare is seen as something that has a peace promoting effect because you provide better welfare, and this is reduces incentives for conflict. I think what our research, particularly looking at three countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, what that research has emphasized is that actually in these contexts, welfare tends to be provided very asymmetrically and is used more as a kind of strategy for political control and maintaining support. So what we've tended to see is that in these situations, welfare provision becomes a kind of an element in establishing what you might call negative peace, rather than in this more kind of positive transformational way that we might typically understand it.
So it's the social protection itself as a power resource, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So far, I think it's clear from what you were saying, the two of you, that here we are talking about intentional collapse or crisis or X.
Yeah.
We are also discussing preventable situations. Also, the predictability, of this collapse is more difficult if it depends on human decision making. It's not as if there is an earthquake that starts, takes place and finishes, right? So that also has to do with the prolongation of the situation. And then with the fact that that social protection is not in neutral ground, but becomes part of the power struggle. So, Tamer, what does your research and your experience on the ground tell us about the power dynamics around aid under these tragic and difficult and extreme circumstances?
Thanks, Juliana, for the opportunity. I think in these contexts, in these fragile contexts or limited contexts of sovereignty, like in the Palestinian case, where it even goes beyond, it's a case where you have a settler colonial occupation that has been lasting since 1948. You have a clinically dead peace process that was supposed to lead to a permanent solution and the creation of a Palestinian state that lives along side by side with Israel. But these peace dreams, if I want to put them this way, have collapsed with all the atrocities and the genocide we see in Gaza and the continuation of occupation policies in the West Bank, with a very right-wing fanatic government in place in Israel now, leading and steering the direction of the politics inside occupied land, and also affecting the regional surrounding in Lebanon, in Syria, a rug state, if I want to put it this way, that is above international law and international legitimacy. it's a very unique and disturbing context in Palestine and the surrounding region. And then this is where donors come. I mean, like in the case of Palestine, I mean, Palestinians don't have control over resources. They live under direct occupation in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. Even with the withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza, they kept their control over borders, over sea, over everything. So you have 7 million Palestinians up roughly living under direct occupation, and the ones who are catering for their services, social welfares, are largely donors in this context. And donors' role here is becoming very influential, but it's a double-edged weapon, if I want to put it this way, because the main strategies or the main aims of aid in this context, in the Palestinian context, it was to bring an end for occupation and to establish a viable state, Palestinian state. And this was limited to a 5 years period of time. This was the Oslo Peace Accords premises. But now we are talking about, since 1948, it's more than 20 years now, where you have this dysfunctional status quo still happening, and the situation is getting worse even. So now the big question of aid now, what are the objectives of aid in this context? If aid is unable to exercise any accountability on Israel, if aid to a large extent has helped indirectly to sustain Israel's occupation because someone is helping and paying the bill for Israel to keep its 5 stars occupation, then that's a problematic aspect of aid. That's one way to look at it. Another way is that, yes, the situation is so extreme, and many researchers, many critics as well, they see that aid in this context is the best available option to keep Palestinians resilient and to keep them, to make sure they stay on their land. So it's a very heated and controversial topic, but at the same time, the uniqueness and the brutality of the situation makes Palestine a very unique case when it comes to comparing it with other contexts because of Israel and because of the legacy of the settler colonial context and now the genocide, the impacts of the genocide war. But regionally, of course, there are lessons to apply when it comes to aid in Yemen, in Syria, and especially aid in contexts that we have legitimacy issues on local actors. Like Yemen, you have 2 governments now, one internationally recognized, one isolated. In Syria, at some point, we have an isolated regime. So again, aid and also legitimacy, it's really an important topic to think about and to examine further in these fragile contexts.
So it seems we have a long-term welfare mix, if you want, right? And we also have the more recent transformation, rapid transformation in Gaza, but also in Sudan, and in which instability becomes itself a power resource. Instability regarding how people will access healthcare, instability regarding whether aid will enter the territory or not, instability regarding what type of aid will be available. So instability becomes a pack and parcel of what I think, Olivier, you referred to as a type of governance. Involving different actors, right? I don't know, perhaps if you could, Olivier, elaborate a little bit more on this notion of governance, hybrid governance, like to move away from collapse as something that just happens to have concepts that bring in political actors and power relations into the picture in a more appropriate way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I can definitely, I can draw a little bit on the political economy of conflict literature. And I think what that literature has tended to emphasize is that, war doesn't lead to a void in terms of institutions and governance, but generally what it leads to is a kind of reconfiguration of governance relationships, or, maybe we see more of these hybrid informal systems emerging. And that's very marked in some of the contexts that we've looked at in our research. Like, for example, in Lebanon, the civil war led to the entrenchment of this system where sectarian groups are the key providers of welfare. And then in other contexts, like in Sri Lanka, for example, war led to a more kind of temporary sort of parallel form of governance where the main rebel group in the areas that were under their control was delivering services and a whole range of different types of services and institutions of governance as well were established. So yeah, I completely agree in the sense that very often this situation of kind of unsettlement and instability can be functional for the parties in the conflict. So very often, I mean, this is part of the reason why we see very prolonged conflicts in certain regions, because that sort of sense of instability is serving particular benefits for certain groups. Just, I mean, a related point I think that comes out of this is sort of challenging a little bit the idea or the kind of the exceptional status of these situations of war. I mean, I completely agree with what's been said about the exceptional nature of the situation in Gaza, but just thinking more broadly about situations of war, it can sometimes be useful to emphasize also the continuities between situations of war and situations of, ceasefire or kind of peace. I think this is Tema was referring to this as well in the case of Gaza, but very often, when we see a ceasefire or an end to the conflict, that doesn't mean that violence ends, completely. It's usually, again, more of a kind of mutation of violence from one form perhaps to another. So maybe the physical violence stops, but then that translates into more kind of structural forms of violence, perhaps.
Yes, and in these cases, Sophia, we are witnessing entire social fabrics under threat, right? So in the case of Gaza specifically, we see a very comprehensive and unprecedented array of old-fashioned tools of mass destruction, like hunger and sickness, which are not modern or new. But we also see high-tech tools of surveillance that help use precise weapons to bomb and destroy life. So it's a combination of the old and the new around those institutions that are key for people's well-being, including families, communities. I'm not talking only about schools and hospitals, although of course I'm also talking about them, but I'm talking also about like kinship and so what institutions matter most for people's well-being under these circumstances, because people are yet surviving and trying to survive. So how do you see that from your own experience?
Thank you, Juliana. Well, in Gaza, very clearly, you, as you well said, this intentional collapse of school, clinics, water systems, local administration, social services, all at once, if I may say, matter. Because it's the all at once collapse, which we may not have seen in other contexts in the same way. But under these conditions, you asked me what institutions matter, and I think the institutions that matter most are the ones somehow closest to people's survival. What do I mean by that? The local groups, informal local groups, any group of people that keeps a water pump working or maintains the shelter systems. Second, maybe even if reduced to minimal capacity clinics and hospitals, as we have seen in Gaza, because a single functioning operating room can mean life or death. So we have seen that. All of us are aware of that. And third, I would say some community and women-led organizations, which often become the most trusted and agile responders because they provide protection and information and psychosocial support and a sense of order. The big question, though, here is that can they survive? Those local groups and minimal hospital services and women-led and community networks, can they survive, and for how long? Because of course some do, because communities rebuild from the ground up anywhere in the world. That is true in Gaza, in Sudan, and anywhere where we have seen conflict. You see volunteers and you see youth networks, you see women's groups, you see health workers stepping up where formal institutions have collapsed. But their survival, of course, depends on two things: that there's some protection of civic space, and without that, even the strongest community and institutions eventually may buckle. And when these formal institutions fall, of course, communities becomes the institution that keeps society alive. But the question is, for how long?
Yes, we are talking about bottom-up survival systems, right? Rather, survival systems that are become as unstable as the context itself. So, Tamer, could you respond some of Sophia's questions regarding how long can these survival strategies survive from your field experience? How do informal networks, the diaspora, religious charities, local actors can still keep going?
Um, uh, Excellent question, Juliana. I'll start with the very extreme case of Gaza because of the uniqueness of the Gaza situation, where it was really cut off of the entire world during the last 2 years, meaning Israel had an upper hand in everything, including weaponizing aid delivery, humanitarian systems, and what we saw in Gaza is which and Gaza proudly had a very strong social capital, if I want to put it this way, before this war. But after 2 years of hunger, humiliation, mass killing, and destruction of everything, sadly, what started happening is literally the survival of the fittest. Basically, they turned Gaza into a jungle where survival becomes a priority, and this social capital has eroded more or less. We saw all these images on TVs, people rushing, stepping on each other to get food from these American kitchens, and the humiliation. It's all by design. I mean, the vulgarity and the inhumane systems that they were put in place in Gaza to humiliate the human inside every Gazan. Then the direct targeting of the huge UN and civil society networks that used to function in a beautiful way before this war. Gaza had a very successful case of a UN delivery system, be it working on developmental related interventions or humanitarians, and mainly UNRWA. I talk about UNRWA here. You can see even how the Israelis went after UNRWA all the way to make sure that there is no parallel system that could remain functioning, and then turning Gaza into this jungle, if I want to put it this way. And this was aired on TV. There is nothing more to add. The entire world watched this. So in this context, when we talk about institutions, really what's left is, and I echo Sophia as well, is whatever is left from some functioning clinics or families or neighbors who could work together somehow in a humane way, and if they're not fully hungry and they still have some sense to collaborate together, then that's it. That's survival basically, because what we saw is social reengineering of society, an Israeli pilot project to socially re-engineer the Gaza social capital, to support warlords, to cut aid, to destroy organizations. It's a horror movie, and it's still a horror movie. I mean, yes, now the war has stopped in its ugly way, but Gaza remains under siege, totally destroyed, and they're still weaponizing aid. People are still hungry, without shelter, without the basics. And I'll tell you, I mean, in the case of Gaza, I mean, now whatever is left from institutions, and these are previous institutions, because there is still a sense of civic order, if I want to put it this way, because there is still a Hamas government that organizes people's lives. They have the weapons, they have the authority to do it. But apart from this, there is nothing. Gaza has been turned into unlivable place. And so Gaza is again the extreme of all extremes, where we see a failure of everything: the international system, humanitarian law, institutions. I don't see any success stories because people are trapped into this genocide. There is no way for them to leave or to escape from this genocide. So I cannot see any success story, because if they were offered the opportunity to leave, they will leave same like any human being, same like any other war in Sudan or in Bosnia, where people could leave to seek safety and refuge somewhere else. But that's not happening in Gaza, and it's yet to be studied the impacts of this genocide on Gazans in the future. We'll see more horrifying and listen to more horrifying stories. Now, and I'll stop here. On other contexts, of course, we can talk more because there is no, I mean, the Israeli factor is so brutal and unique when it comes to control over everything. I don't see it happening in another context, including in Syria or Sudan. Humanitarian agencies or agents can act to some degree with limitations or threats, but there are ways to intervene. Gaza again remains the up norm or the extreme scenario.
Thank you. Talking about then the sustainability of survival strategies and welfare strategies, Olivier, your work that makes that distinction between welfare alternatives and surviving strategies, right, as two distinct scenarios. I don't know, could you elaborate a little bit more on this distinction as it relates to what Sophia and Tamer were saying just before?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not, I think what we've written about is not so related to situations like Gaza where, we're talking about survival from the bottom up. I suppose it's more about, so I think you can make a distinction between welfare systems which are kind of quite responsive or reactive, which are serving the interests of particular groups in power, and where welfare is kind of being used to kind of generate a degree of stability, maybe to kind of satisfy certain core constituencies or to kind of prevent grievances from boiling over. So that was one type of situation that we saw. I suppose a more like resilient kind would be, a welfare system that is trying to actually challenge or transform inequalities and overcome discrimination, providing more support to kind of marginalized groups, I guess.
I guess, well, it's as this conversation is showing, it's very difficult not to talk about Gaza specifically and differently from the other situations we also mentioned as very extreme and unstable. Because, Sophia, in this case, it seems that we've reached a new normal in which aid can be sitting a couple of kilometers away from where women are delivering without clean water, without anesthesia, children being amputated without anesthesia, babies going hungry and dying from starvation next to those kilometers of trucks full of food. I mean, I'd like to ask you about this because I'm not sure in comparative social policy we have concepts for this. And one of the reasons to have this conversation is to conceptualize what's going on, because otherwise we will not be able to research. Without concepts, we have no scientific production, right? And the fact that it's a unique situation, an extreme situation, doesn't excuse us from theorizing it and drawing lessons and knowledge from it, right? And also, of course, policy implications. So how do you make sense of this situation, of normalizing this so abnormal situation?
Oh, Juliana, I find actually your question quite deeply moving, because when the world gets used to the unbearable, we are really in dangerous territory. Because what we're seeing in Gaza, and we go back to Gaza in this conversation, is of course not the failure of logistics or resources. The aid is there, the medicine is there, the world has the trucks, the fuel, the doctors, the expertise. This is political will that is missing. So humanitarian access is restricted even in other contexts of war. It may be restricted by terrain where there's simply bridges that don't exist anymore, or roads. So, but here the restriction is a matter of policy. I think this is why we're facing this just terrible phenomenon, because as you just said, amputations of children are being done without anesthesia, 10 kilometers away from a first world hospital. And by the way, I had never in my professional life as in humanitarian aid heard these two words together, and that's pediatric amputations. That I had never heard. And it's the largest number of pediatric amputations without anesthesia being in the history of humankind. I went to Ukraine, to Kyiv, amidst the war, and it's absolutely horrific to see young men and women amputated. I have a son who is 25 years old, and seeing these destroyed lives in Kyiv of young men and women amputated, but you knew they went to the front line. You kind of, it's awful, but you had that in the back of your mind, as horrible as it may be. But I really put myself in the place of a child, a girl, a boy in Gaza who is suffering an amputation, and there's more than 2,000 of them, and they must think we are all monsters because somehow, if some spheres are like an event like that, if they're seen as normal because it just has gone on for so long, then we normalize it. That's a true kind of moral failure of all of us. We must resist normalization, Juliana, because we must name it clearly. This is deliberate obstruction. This is collapse of political will of the international community. And I think this has a profound erosion on humanitarian and human norms. And here I believe that, the humanitarian system that, of course, upholds the values of neutrality or impartiality, faced with this cannot be silent, because when access to anesthesia is denied, when access to hospital care is denied in this way, I think humanitarians actually have a responsibility to speak, to advocate, and to mobilize diplomatic pressure, because neutrality does not mean silence in the face of absolutely preventable suffering. So if we treat access denial as routine, we actually weaken humanitarian norms everywhere.
But it seems that in this case, one key component of the welfare mix of an informal security regime was in place in Gaza, in the case of Gaza, before October 7th, has been neutralized. Right, and so that was, as Tamer's work has shown, like the key lifeline through UNRWA, and the dismantling of the UN agency has also meant the dismantling of the key tool to access so many things. Now, none of this can be done without narratives and ways of making this legitimate under the eyes of key powerful actors. So. Olivier, your work does, looks into this issue, right, of how narratives about fairness, grievance, and visibility shape the political value of aid. And I wonder how we could draw from your work to this very distinct, to make sense of this very distinct situation.
Yeah, thanks. So I think, again, I'm not clear exactly how it can relate to the situation in Gaza, given how distinctive that is. But I mean, broadly, what we were emphasizing in the research that we did was that, there's clearly expectations around social welfare do vary very considerably across contexts, and the kind of narratives that surround social welfare vary significantly from one context to the next, and also within context as well. So there are different expectations for different groups. So in these three countries that we've been looking at in our research, for example, in Iraq, that there's a strong sort of constitutional commitment to sharing of natural resources with citizens, for example. So that led to quite high expectations. And that's in contrast to somewhere like Lebanon, where there's relatively limited expectations around what the central government can do. And I suppose, our research also touched a little bit on questions about the how aid is distributed and the narrative surrounding that. So again, looking at Lebanon, one of my colleagues, Maisa Baroud, has written about how Syrian refugees have been scapegoated in that context, and how the media and politicians have kind of spread misinformation about how much aid they're receiving and how this is playing a role in driving crime. So these kind of narratives can be very pervasive. And I think, another context where we see this kind of the international politics of aid coming through very strongly is Jordan, that came out in our research, where you see international donors, the geopolitics is very kind of strong in terms of providing aid primarily to reduce refugee flows or to kind of, pursue certain geopolitical security interests, and then similarly the government using aid as a key source of revenue, using it as a means of shoring up support amongst citizens rather than, how we might expect in terms of developing a more equitable welfare system.
Thank you. Tamer, would you like to jump in regarding
Yeah,
the
I
same
mean,
question?
I think just something to add to what Oliver has discussed pertaining these three specific contexts, and I just want to expand the discussion a little bit more on the entire MENA region, Middle East region, and to focus more or to bring up the discussion on aid in contested context of governance where you don't have legitimacy, and these are becoming now world phenomena, because sadly we don't live in a great war anymore, a great world. I mean, with all these changing political dynamics worldwide, and I mean, we see an emerge. We are living the emergence of a new world order. We don't know how will it look eventually, but one symptom or one clear evidence, we see more increasing conflicts. I mean, as we speak now, probably I think there are 50 ongoing conflicts worldwide somewhere in this big globe. But back to the region, I think we need also more to understand when we say donors and aid, we're not talking about a homogeneous body anymore, because of this because of the word polarized politics now. We have, of course, Western donors, be it OECD, be it US, Canada, whatever. Then we have a group of rich countries as well, like Gulf countries in the Arab world who have their own agenda as well. You have China, you have Russia, you have many players now. And of course, aid comes with politics and agenda as well. And this makes the story more complicated. And if I want to go back to Gaza, for example, for us to understand the impacts of aid in a very controversial context like Palestine, we need to trace donors' agenda as well, and they act differently on different agenda and different preconditions as well. So this has also to be more researched in the welfare context to understand also how aid affects the welfare priorities of the societies in comparison to donors' agenda priorities. That's something that has to be further understood and examined. In Yemen, of course, we see donors' preferences where they're going. They're going towards the south, not the north. And the outcome of aid is totally different, where the focus in the north is on survival humanitarianism, and in the south, no, they're building a state apparatus in a divided context of governance and legitimacy. Syria has witnessed this until the collapse of the Assad regime, but now what we're seeing also, competition among donors. The Gulf donors have their own agenda. The Turks have their own agenda. The Europeans are supporting some priorities versus the Americans. And it's like a huge menu of priorities and interventions where what the main elephant in the room or the missing voices are the local voice, because representation remains an issue. We are not dealing with legit context. And I think this is where the discussion or the future agenda of studying aid in this multipolar, very political world we're moving towards now should be also further dealt with, because we're still missing the picture. Most of the literature on aid comes from the Western perspective, OECD principles of engagement in fragile contexts and stable contexts, but I haven't read any engagements or principles from the BRICS or from China or Russia or from Gulf countries. And these are all equally important donors, and they're competing as well. They're rich donors as well with political agenda. To close here, when I make this comparison, I'll just throw an example. The BRICS is an emerging global power, a global coalition that has its unique governance characteristics. These are not democratic countries or contexts, but they're rich, they're powerful, and they have their own agenda in the countries they decide to help. Opposite to OECD context and opposite to other contexts like rich GCC countries. So these have to be, I mean, we'll see even more exciting but troubling stories coming because of these political agenda of aid and the preferences of donors. The multiple donors, they have joined the game now, opposite to the old traditional donors.
Thank you. And this includes also considering regime change happening in the US, as Levitsky and other very prestigious researchers are referring to it, right? Being the US a primary donor from the previous world we are leaving behind, right? So of course, yeah, this conversation about aid is taking place in the context of radical change. And I'm glad, Tamer, that you bring in this idea of a very kind of like plural, contested, conflictive field. And Delphine Pinault on the chat was mentioning the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, right, as a new player. As an example, right, of this changing field. Now, the world of aid we are leaving behind was far from ideal,
correct,
as well, right? And it also reinforced power relations between those in charge and those in charge of giving aid and those receiving it. So it's not as easy as longing for the good old days. So in this context, Sophia, in the context of the work on decolonizing aid, are there in this context any promising approaches? Is there any light? And I stress aid because we are discussing contexts in which it's very difficult to see an emerging positive welfare mix without that component. It doesn't mean that that component is sufficient, will be sufficient, but it's very hard to think about it without it, right?
Well, Juliana, I coordinate now the Latin American Forum on Decolonizing Aid precisely because it's not about the good old days. It's about really reshaping, reimagining aid in different ways. And it continues to be, of course, an important element. And this amidst these tectonic shifts in the aid sectors, you well said, US aid, by no means ideal, but it's now entirely gone. And the UK and France and Germany and Sweden and the Netherlands, all global north countries that were significant donors have reduced their aid budget. So these are true tectonic, telluric shifts in the aid sector. And if I may say, this is just the tragic aspect of it. It's also cutting aid to militarize, given that NATO is not anymore the alliance so everyone is militarizing themselves. We all know these really complex and shifts, and we don't know exactly where the chips will fall in all of this. And by the way, Tamer, it's actually now we have 120 active conflicts in the world, that by far the largest since the Second World War. It's not 120 countries because in some countries there's more than one. But and by the way, when we think of militarization, imagine that right now the world has weapons enough to destroy 15 times the planet. I always wonder, once you've destroyed it once, what are the other 14 times for, right? So it's kind of insanity. Last year, $2.7 trillion invested in weapons. So, but what happens when all of these institutions collapse, including aid, as we know it? Here, so I think some of the most promising approaches come from local efforts, and not necessarily in all contexts, because in some that even is complex. But I do want to acknowledge, for example, the Sudan emergency room effort. So community-led social protection networks, are essential. And here we actually have a bottom-up, if you will. I don't like that expression, but a network that was established based on those solidarity groups, and it's cash support, evacuation routes. So those are essential. So in some contexts that has worked. Second, maybe where is there some hope? There is still flexible trust-based funding that goes directly to local groups, allowing them to respond quickly without navigating impossible compliance burdens that aid has imposed on communities. So here, I think the Sudan emergency group rooms may also be a good example. And third, hope from horizontal coordination of youth groups, women's collectives, health volunteers, working in webs, rather than waiting for kind of centralized commands. And of course, here, the big question is, who decides in all of this? Because decolonizing aid means shifting power so that people living in the crisis shape the response rather than receive it. And these approaches, by the way, Juliana and all, of course, by no means replace the state, but they must keep the social fabric alive long enough for recovery to be possible. So the question again is for how long it can be kept alive. So again, the most effective responses in context of deliberate collapse are those designed and led by the people living in the crisis. Well, they always are, but even more so, and often they are the only option, as we have seen in Sudan.
So from the point of view of comparative research on social policy and welfare mixes, we would need to differentiate like the immediate response, the survival strategies as the intended comprehensive collapse of institutions unfolds. And we would need to distinguish this stage from the following one that hopefully would lead to a more stable and more and better and actual conditions for life, right? Because the current situation is a very extreme circumstance in which everything is falling apart, right? So you need mechanisms that are able to quickly react to that, and then you would need to rebuild, right? But rebuilding is not possible until you create minimum conditions to that aim, right? Which, for example, are not present in the case of Gaza at the moment. So I was wondering, Olivier, from your experience conducting empirical research, I mean, is it possible to conduct research, for example, about Gaza and also Sudan? I mean, how would you go about empirical research there? On the one hand, we have new technologies, we are able to see so much online. On the other hand, of course, access to work on the ground is impossible. Could you share any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. I mean, with the caveat that I've not done research in those two contexts, but maybe the others can jump in. I'm sure there's many specific considerations. So we have been doing some research recently, as I mentioned, in Lebanon, where the war has escalated during the time when we've been doing the research. I mean, I think one key consideration is to do with the kind of the fact that many of the populations in these regions would they've been subjected to very extractive forms of research, both by aid agencies and academic researchers, and so there may be quite high levels of fatigue. So I think similar to what others have said, in a way, having a degree of trust is kind of the critical starting point, I would say, and also ensuring that the research is connected to their lives and their interests. So ensuring that the research has some kind of meaningful impact, I think, is quite important in these types of situations. And of course, there's many other considerations to, like, more generally to doing research in conflict-affected regions relating to safety and security of the communities that you're working with, and many other issues that we can discuss, the way in which research can be interpreted in such contexts. But yeah, I think the question of extractive research and fatigue is a very important one.
And precisely related to that, Oliver, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think one critical matter would be to bring in researchers based in these settings. Like during the past 2 years, I've seen so many scholars in Gaza, even and in the West Bank as well. I'm not as familiar with the situation in Sudan, like doing their best to keep going with their studies, their research, their reading. And one question, I think, from the point of view of international organizations such as the International Sociological Association and our research committee, is how to bridge, how to help them rather than do the research ourselves. Also, like establish these links. Now, as I was interviewing people based in Ramallah a few months ago, it was hard enough to have a conversation online, to plan, let alone, have like organized fieldwork under these circumstances. The dilemma, I think, is, what we can do that on the one hand honors the actual situation, which is unlivable, on the other hand doesn't make it invisible and then rule out any possibility because the situation is unlivable. So Tamer, being closer to this scenario, I mean, do you have any ideas regarding how to go about this?
Yeah, very good question, Juliana. I mean, it's for me, what's shocking now is that for us researchers, I think there is so much evidence, available evidence on everything we could think about researching when it comes to the context of Palestine, not Palestine only, because of social media, because of innovation. I mean, you just change a TV channel, you can, or open an influencer page on Facebook. You could follow live how a community in southern Yemen is living on daily basis. I mean, technology is also is extremely now advantageous to our goals when it comes to research. And I think we have also to pick up on these changing dynamics when it comes to being able to live the situation without being physically there, but experience it and get a very deep understanding of it, just because of what the tools we have now to know what's happening now on a street in Gaza at this moment. I can do it by calling someone or following a page of an influencer who's broadcasting live from a neighborhood and filming how are they cooking, and also asking questions to kids or to ladies involved in something. I mean, I think we have so much available now, but we have to get out of our traditional mindset of doing research and embrace innovation into research itself. And this also requires some innovation and updates in the IRB process, the ethical research, whatever, because AI is there, innovation is there, but we're still stuck to very old classical means that don't catch up with these exciting developments that really provide us with a treasure of information to further explore and do research on all these situations. And so I think that's my idea. I mean, we don't have to prove genocide when we see it happening in Earth on TVs. I mean, more or less, yes, there are due diligence and legal processes, but you see the crime happening in front of your eyes. I mean, and it's easy to document it, to talk about it, and to get in touch with the victims, and so and this applies to all other matters related to development, humanitarian aid, etc. Um, if I may, I just want also to jump just a step back to also to the previous discussion on the frameworks to decolonize aid, and also to get a better understanding of the upcoming challenges the globe is experiencing. I think we also need to embrace new frameworks, meaning when we talk about fragility now, it's not related to Sudan or to Gaza or I mean, fragility is a global context now. I worry of some states inside the richest country in the world and the most powerful in the US, where fragility is becoming very chronic when it comes to lack of food or lack of health or natural disasters that is coming. We need to also equip ourselves with learning early warning systems that hint to upcoming crises. Syria was one of them. And by the way, the discussion on Syria, even in the Arab world, has missed a key factor that caused the eruption of the civil war, which was droughts, 7 years of droughts that have contributed to people migrating from rural areas to centers, to cities that are not equipped to deliver social services. And you have the explosion. This was a combined by other political and racial factors, but this was a critical factor. There is now the world has started opening the discussion on SDGs and where does it stand, and it's another failure. 35% progress as we talk now. That's the SDGs. So we are not even there on target to meet the target to cross the 50% threshold. Why? In all SDGs, there are also they were designed to tackle also humanitarian issues, conflict issues. All the goals are more or less related to this discussion as well. But I don't see and because the literature is biased again, because what a conflict or fragile context means to someone sitting in the north could be different to someone sitting in the South. I don't think we have the same terminologies to describe the situation. So we need to have a more open, courageous discussion on maybe reintroducing or reframing the lenses, the theoretical lenses through which we agree on what we see, that we see through common eyes, through human eyes, not north-south or something else. Because I think there's so many common in this world now to worry about, not in conflict-ridden countries per se, but in rich, developed countries that have alarming levels of fragility that could explode at any point. But we're missing to see the signs. And thank you.
Yes, thank you for your comments, Tamer. I think one issue is that it's one thing to document what's going on, and it's another thing to be able to rethink theoretical and methodological lenses. That I mean, social research is quite inertial after all, right? Because we're always building on what was previously done and engaging with peers that worked before us, and so there is some inertia, I think, in how we think, for example, the stability of various welfare mixes, which prevent us from being able to say meaningful things, things that a journalist would not be able necessarily to say. I mean, what's our value added here? It's my question. I mean, it's not so obvious, especially when the situations in extreme circumstances, like the ones we've been discussing today, are changing so fast all the time, right? And so, I mean, one of the main concerns that Sophia and I had when we were thinking about bringing together these two communities of social policy researchers and people involved in decolonizing aid is that maybe, you know, this dialogue across disciplines and across professional practices can help us identify new venues, you know, to identify that value added. So as we are approaching the end of this conversation, I would like, you know, maybe go to Sophia first, reflecting on how how you see this conversation adding to what was your previous thinking about this matter.
Well, I really am very thankful for all the perspectives shared, yours, Juliana, and Tamer's, and Oliver's, because I think precisely this bridge building between practitioners and researchers is more critical than ever, and all progressive forces of the world. You know, we have been living a bit in our silos, and as a practitioner for 30 years, and I have worked in humanitarian response and development efforts. I just feel it's indispensable, and I want to kick myself for not having maybe established stronger ties earlier, because as maybe we didn't see all of this coming, but some of the signs were pretty evident and have been for a long time. So I also think that what we have been discussing about the women's groups, the young people getting together, the neighbors where that is possible, like in Sudan, that basic tissue, when they minimally work, is also a platform to regain dignity. And it's from there that everyone can, rather than just waiting for the solutions to arise. And I think it's from there what can we do concretely to showcase it, to support it, also for it to thrive, but showcase it because that's where you kind of regain faith if you are amidst a conflict. So I think putting the emphasis and the spotlight on those efforts is critically important, because many of the dialogues right now are about the big aid institutions, the big institutions that have collapsed. So I think we have a responsibility to place the spotlight there. And I'm really thankful for this dialogue. It's been incredibly eye-opening, and thank you in particular to the three of you. And I wish questions would have arisen in the chat box, but I see it's quite empty. So your comments or questions rather, or your reflections would be so welcome to enrich our own thinking. So thank you.
So I'm underlining these showcases of success stories as something that we need to think about it. And turning to Olivier, I mean, you talk about the political you do a political sociological approach, right? I mean, and I wonder how I know you haven't researched these extreme scenarios, but what you have researched, can we draw anything as far as, the moving forward as the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, so the political sociology, I guess what we're emphasizing there is there has been this kind of political economy approach, which emphasizes the importance of understanding the interaction between political and economic interests. And I suppose what we're saying is it's also important to understand the discourses, the narratives, and that's where the kind of social aspect comes in a little bit more. So yeah, that I think particularly when we're thinking about social welfare, that's important. And just to pick up on the points that the others have made, yeah, I've also found it a really interesting conversation, and it resonates. So I think what Tamer was saying about the fragility being a global phenomenon, I think very much resonates with so the field that I kind of most closely associate with, development studies. There's been this debate about the shift from international development to global development, and whether we need to start recognizing these similarities across global north and global south perspectives. So I think in that debate, interestingly, some others have pushed back and said, actually, no, it's important to maintain this distinction between global south and global north because global south contexts have this kind of colonial experience which is distinctive. So I think that's kind of an interesting debate, but I think it definitely speaks to the general point, which is that there is this shaking up of academic disciplines, which I think is very healthy and very positive, and we can learn a lot from it. And then just on the point that Sophia was mentioning about the kind of mutual aid and these more bottom-up approaches, we've recently been doing some work looking at marginalized groups and how they've experienced economic crisis in Sri Lanka and Lebanon. And what was interesting there was that, as you've said, Sophia, a lot of these groups, like we were looking at queer communities and migrant domestic workers specifically in these two contexts, and they were very much left out of kind of existing social welfare provision, both by governments but also by the international system as well. So we saw, the mutual aid types setups being very important in those situations, but also interestingly, some of these groups it was more of a kind of deliberate choice, I think, to disengage from international support systems because they found them so they didn't cater to their needs. So that's another aspect, I think, is that sometimes we see groups that just out of choice are kind of disengaging and relying more like on these international solidarity networks and things, which I think again is quite an interesting development.
Yes, before turning to Tamer, I'd just like to say that I think the changes in the global scenario for social policy is making some of us who've been doing comparative social policy analysis for such a long time be very self-critical and self-aware of how we could do our research without acknowledging the role of colonial powers, for instance. Like in this literature, colonialism plays no role. I mean, at least in the literature that's focused on Latin America. But it does seem today that we have to go back to the classics and go back, to theoretical sources to really understand what's going on. For instance, in Central America, where we have like a shift towards authoritarianism, we see a very strong role of colonial powers, defining the priorities, the policy priorities. And by the way, not only the U.S. but Israel as well in the provision of military equipment, for instance, and making it as field work as in the past, what was the case of Guatemala during the Dirty War in the 1980s. So anyways, so everything seems to be, we need to revisit some of the assumptions and the ideas we had taken for granted until now. So back to you, Tamer, for your closing comments.
Well, you gave me the most difficult part to close. No, I'm just kidding. No. I'll just pick on what you said, Juliana, because I think on the return of colonial forces or influences. I mean, in my opinion, of course, and this also might imply or include Latin America. I mean, the colonial legacy never left this part of the world where I live. It changed its faces and its tools and its tools of influence. But it exists in every corner of policy, decision making, politics, influence, name it. I mean, it's still there, but in different shapes and under different faces. And this brings me to our roles as academics, as researchers. What I worry about is it's becoming more difficult, at least I'll speak on my behalf, on my case, to write about these things using the colonial lens again, because the research industry itself has to be decolonized for us to be able to write freely as well. We see more tendencies of oppressing different opinions, of oppressing, exposing situations as they happen, because also the publishing industry has become very commercial and very political as well, in a very aggressive way. And this has been, we have been witnessing this really happening. It's hard to write about Israel and about the colonial legacy. It's hard to write about the BRICS even, because many publishing houses in the West don't want to recognize that there is a BRICS or there is a changing world order. We meet ambassadors here. They refuse to hear that China is next door or India is there and Russia has expanded its influence. It's just this denial, which we can see it also in the way Ukraine and Russia are fighting and the atrocities of the war. It's just denial. There is a sense of racism, superiority as well. And somehow this ugly political world we live in has also reached research and academia and publishing houses, where true voices are not able really to write about things and describe them from this humanistic, neutral lens anymore because of the way the industry has changed. This is, I think, another stress that we will face more and more in this more complicated world. And I don't have an answer, to be honest. But it's not getting easier. Maybe we have to think also differently, to do research through different means and platforms, not only the common ones we have to work with to survive as academics as well.
Well, I think you've given us an excellent topic for a future webinar on the decolonization of research. Well, I think as we come to an end, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I think this conversation shows that we need it. We need conversations like this one, especially like learning from each other and listening to each other. I think it creates a reflective space, right? So a heartfelt thank you to our speakers, Oliver Walton, Tamer Karmout, and Sofia Sprechman. Thank you for your insights. To Ana Luego and Josué Serra for their translation, their generosity in providing voluntary work to help us reach a community of non-English speakers. And to all of you, our audience, participants, thank you for your presence. Thank you for being here. We hope this is just the beginning of many more conversations to come. Take good care, and let me see if there is anything well, thank you for your thank yous. And we hope to see you soon. And also I'd like to thank Claudia Caselli from Acapacá, and also Alba Murcia from Acapacá, also Enrique de la Mónica from RC19. All three of them help us with the logistic, the communication, the reaching out to be here today. So thank you all.
Thank you, Juliana, for your excellent moderation. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliana. Thanks for the opportunity, and pleasant meeting everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to meet you all. And thanks, Juliana.
Thank you.
Thank you.